For those of you who don't know me, my name is Allana Lindgren, and I'm teaching at the University of Victoria, not these days, but normally. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this final panel. I can't believe that we're already here. It's been a very full and rich day. And this panel clearly was listening to you throughout the day because we have children, we have artists. It's all right here to wrap up for you. And so this session is called Performance in/as Archive. And we wanted to wrap things up with a discussion about performance's roles as archive, as well as the consideration of the role of the artist in animating the archive. And this is a very exciting topic for me, and we have a fantastic roster of speakers today, and I'll actually introduce them one by one as they're going up to give their presentations. But when we all sort of met online, the questions that I asked these three people to think about were these. So here are the questions. How does your archive or creative work animate the past? In the context of your own work, what does an archive mean? What kinds of archives do you access? And then to present and introduce themselves to you one by one, as they will do in a moment, I asked them to give one brief example of your creative work, their creative work, and discuss how it's intersected with archives. And of course, being artists, they've come up with some really interesting, exciting ways to discuss that with you. So our first speaker is Lindsay Gazitza Gatste Delaronde, and she is Ghanaian Haga woman of Ghana Wege, sorry, almost got there. And she's also my dear colleague at the University of Victoria. For the past 12 years, Lindsay has been a grateful, active, and contributing guest on the Lekwungen Territory, Victoria, British Columbia. She has a Master's of Fine Arts and a Master of Arts in Indigenous Communities Counseling Psychology program from the University of Victoria. She is currently the Indigenous Resurgence Coordinator for the Faculty of Fine Arts at the University of Victoria. And her areas of research are contemporary and traditional First Nations art and expressive arts therapy, working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, incorporating arts and counseling. Her artistic practice focuses on Indigenous theater, land-based, site-specific performance art, collaborative practice, cultural resurgence, and social political activism through the arts. Her artistic media includes photography, performance, visual studio arts, which has enabled her to create and share critically informed, culturally competent Indigenous arts across various disciplines. She combines her world view from an Indigenous perspective, cultural understanding, academic learning, and artistic skills, which together inform her arts practice and her ability to share Indigenous perspectives with the public in a good and very positive way. Please welcome Lindsay.
My English name is Lindsay Delaronde. I'm Ghanaian Haga from Ghana, a very grateful visitor and guest here on the Lekwungen Territory. Today my presentation has a lot of visuals. It's very fragmented, and I think this is the exact reason why I want to go back to school. And so just giving some language to what I've been experiencing as an artist, and so the majority of the work that I'm going to be sharing is just through photography, some performances that I've done, and so hopefully some of my practice you'll be able to see manifest in the work that I do. So it's very heavily visual. I do have disclaimers that the images that I'm going to be sharing are not filmed or replicated in any capacity to respect the people that I've worked with, the collaborations that I've worked with, as I do a lot of collaborative work, and I work a lot with women. And so I want to start off the presentation with acknowledging all of the women that I've been able to work with, and all of the mentorship and conversations and the narratives and the conflicts have all shaped and informed the way that I work, and all of the fragments of the way that I work, that hopefully through time and through experience and through more conversation and navigating conflict, that there'll be a resolve. But in this process of where I am at now, it is really kind of in flux, I guess. But I want to start off with this photograph of me and my siblings, really looking back at my relationship to performance as an artist. We were part of a dance group in Kahnawake, and we did performances in cultural presentations of Iroquois song and dance, not knowing that I would later on become a performance artist with an interest in theater. And so when I bring back down the grounding of my practice, this is really where it's begun. And so we would do these cultural presentations in Old Montreal, which is 20 minutes outside of my community. And so really just to start off that place, that my perceptions and the way that I understand the world is really from that place, Ganyakahaga territory, my ethics, my protocols, my conduct, all of that is ingrained in our Gayanarda Goa, our great law, our culture, our customs. And so that's something that in terms of my practice that I try to research in everything that I do. And now moving to the West Coast with a whole new understanding of Coast Salish Kopakuaku channel protocol and the complexities of nation-to-nation building and the complex political landscape that we live in today. Really honoring the teachers, the mentors of this territory, of this land that has shaped and again permeated into my consciousness about how to really create work that strategize to uphold the people. And fundamentally, I am going to present some of these images with the grounding foundation that the land is the archive. And so when you look through these images, that's what I want you to be sort of reflecting on, that although these women are part of these photo series and photo projects, that fundamentally it's the land that's governing us, and it's not the other way around. So starting from that place, bringing you to, I would say, the project that really changed everything for me was a project titled In Defiance. And what had happened in this process of moving through historical trauma through the body, working with women for self-determination. So all these photographs were about embodying, restoring, recreating a narrative, a positive narrative. And so the relationship building between each person, very crucial. They got to self-determine where and how and when they wanted to be photographed. And then in the exhibition that happened at the Legacy Gallery in 2016, each woman was able to pick the photo that they wanted to be part of the exhibition. And so that self-governance and self-determination is really crucial to my practice. So what these women have taught me in looking through the camera, looking through the lens, there was an equivalent of 34 Indigenous women part of this exhibition, and what they had taught me was the importance of coming back to the land. Prior to photographing women, specifically with the In Defiance project, there was no inquiry, connection to the land, and it happened in the experience of photographing that coincidentally and not coincidentally, that every single woman that I photographed wanted to be in the territory. They wanted to be in the water, they wanted to be in the earth, they wanted to be in cedar trees. And so this was the awakening of understanding that healing intergenerational trauma of Indigenous people is coincide with wellness in relationship to the land and territory. So I'll share some of those photographs. Dakota Brand, Kelly Aguirre, Erin Gilpin, who also just graduated from her PhD in Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria, looking at land as body and body as land, wellness and self-governance. And so these women in my life have shaped how I think and view land in relationship to wellness. And so Carolyn Victor from the Stalo territory, we talked about the importance of her fishing territory. This is in the Fraser River, and so there's specific areas in that river where her family generation after generation could go fish. And so what's so profound about that for me is that nation to nation, the family structures, the dynamics between resources is all fundamentally in the philosophy of how they live and be in the world to continue the way that they live off the land. So that was that project that, let's see, where's the internet on here? I'm lost. Okay, so that work ended in 2016, but also didn't end because I'm available for that continued work moving forward. So this moves me into my work. Back in 2017, I was elected the first Indigenous artist in residence for the city of Victoria, and I started my residency specifically focusing on site-specific performance art. Yeah, we don't need sound actually for this if you just do the visuals. And so I really wanted to start off in relation to this topic of archive as the spirit as archive. The spirituality, the stuff that we don't see. And so this piece was called We Bring Medicine to the Street, where we wash the streets with cedar water. This is a collaboration with a non-Indigenous artist. And so when I think of archive, I think of the spiritual and spirits that are still in presence, in space, that we can activate, that we can communicate with, to honor the ancestors of not just this territory, but all of the people that live and reside on this land. And so specifically we chose Pandora Street, where there's a lot of the fentanyl crisis that has been occurring in our communities. The loss, the grief, the sorrow, the pain, the addiction, the homelessness, the forgotten population that is so much that shapes our urban communities and identities, and actually offers a lot of service for civilians who live here to offer service work too. And so this piece was in memory of my late partner who had passed away from the fentanyl crisis. And so I started off my residency really trying to understand grief and loss and the embodiment of processing trauma, the importance of performance, the importance of not just processing things emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, but also physically. And so a lot of my work in terms of the performative is really about healing. So I wanted to say that. And then this work, I'll show a little bit of the Indigenous artists in residence. So more images really about being on the land, being on the territory, engaging creatively, more collaborations. This was a collaboration with another Mohawk artist who lives here, Cheryl Henhawk. And so embodying land through land-based drawings, and then engaging in conversation with Cheryl and was documented by Valerie Celeste. So these types of artworks could be very intimate. Some of the work that I do is very intimate, and then some of the work that I'll show is very public. This was the second piece that was created with co-facilitation with Monique Celeste, who's owner of Reno Dance here in Victoria. We had collaborated on creating an Indigenous framework from Kim Anderson, who did her research on Native identity, Native women identity, and we used her structure to restrict, construct, reclaim, resist, act, construct. And we created these narratives, this somatic movement, and we all told our trauma stories with the need that wasn't met at the time, and also the resolve that we were looking for that we didn't get as well. And so all of this work got translated in somatic movement, and then we co-created this piece together and performed it at the legislature building, which is that meeting point of activism, of confronting colonialism. And so again, looking at site-specific landscapes within Victoria specifically, and that was working with the collaboration of Indigenous and non-Indigenous women. It's another image of it. This piece was also performed at the legislature in the grass area connected to the One Way Festival back in 2018. And this was with Tlingit artist Nahan, who lives in Seattle. And we did a piece together about honoring the feminine and the masculine, looking at the impacts of colonialism on relationship, and coming back into a resolve through remembering the culture, remembering songs, remembering the drum, remembering the scent. And so I think that from my work, a lot of it is about activating the holistic body, to be able to, what Monique Mojica taught me was to be a really good receptor. How do you keep the body well and the vessel well in order to receive the information, process information, and then give information back out? So reciprocity is extremely important in my work as well. That's just another image of that. Okay, and then what happened after that? This is like 3 years or 10 minutes. Okay. All right. Then I moved into the theater world, accidentally, but not. This is a really short clip of the very first Indigenous showcase hosted at the Belfry. And what we had done was community theater, basically. And so looking at the already established drumming groups and performance, and we started to really come together as a collective and create from both a traditional place and a contemporary place, hence why we titled it Pendulum. So it was an oscillation between contemporary and traditional, and then also the great joys and pains of life and the oscillation between the complexities of the emotions. So we had cultural performances as well as contemporary performances in Pendulum. so that's an example of pendulum. That moved into the second year of my residency where we created Supernova. So the first one kind of stitched the contemporary and the traditional, and so the archive in terms of, documents and history was all embedded in the relationships. What we were able to show, what we weren't able to show, consultation, relationship, reviving of new regalia, old regalia, and the beautiful thing about coming together in this way that I'm moving more into the direction of theater is the holistic approach of uniting our communities together and for healing our communities and for giving voice to our communities. We work with the beginner, intermediate, advanced performers to really weave the show together in a good way. And then we, last year, 2019, we did the last production. Both were directed by Monique as well. And we did Supernova, which we used the concept of the exploding star to create new galaxy with the tension between the destruction and the creation. And each person takes that concept and creates a work from that place. And so the beautiful thing about this group in particular, the New Channel community, the first show, they had permission to use bear dance that's used in potlatch. They got permission to use it for pendulum. And they were invited to come back to do Supernova, and they created a brand new piece, composed a brand new dance and song that started in theater that now moved into the potlatching. And so that's a really beautiful opportunity that you give to community. And so my work, although it's comes through me, it's not about me, it's never about me, it's always about creating opportunity for Indigenous people specifically, with a focus on challenging stereotypes and prejudice and all of those really difficult political conflicts that we have. And so things that I wrote down were archive, body memory, being a receptor, a translator, expression of memory, blood memory, and then also the land itself, the mounds, the sacred spaces, listening from the land, both urban and rural, witnessing and observing as archive. Some people were talking about the audience as being part of the archive. That's a big West Coast concept of the importance of being a witness and then your responsibility to tell other people in the community what you saw, engaging with the land, sacred places, internal, both internal and external, archive as oral tradition, storytelling, as well as I started to think about archive as government legislation and law. That a lot of us reviving and resurging our cultural knowledges is understanding the truth. And so we need to go back into those documents that exist and form the work that we do as well. And so that as an archive. And then preserving performance is in direct parallel with preserving the land. Because if you destroy the land, then you destroy the memory, you destroy the culture, the history, the sacred spaces, the burial sites. The erasure of Indigenous history is embedded in the land. And so my work cannot exist without community and does not exist without the land. And those are my two constants that I've worked in forever. So, and that's really all I want to share, so thank you.
Thank you. I'll come to the mic. Our next speaker is Dr. Kathy Carbone, and she is a postdoctoral scholar and lecturer in the Department of Information Studies at the University of Victoria, Los Angeles. She's an independent, and she's also an independent archivist. Before joining UCLA, she was the Institute Archivist and Performing Arts Librarian for over a decade at the California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, you might know it as. And she was a modern dancer and choreographer for more than 20 years. Dr. Carbone holds a PhD in Information Studies from UCLA and an MLIS from Kent State University, an MA in Dance and Music, and a BFA in Dance from Ohio University, which is a great school for dance. Her research and teaching focuses on contemporary art practices with archives, documenting and archiving performance, human rights, social justice, and archives. Art and forced migration, and digital community archives. These are all the areas in which she does research. She's currently the PI and archivist for the Amplification Project, Digital Archive for Forced Migration, Contemporary Art and Action. Her work appears in the journals Archivaria, Archives and Records, the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, the International Journal of Human Rights, and Archival Science. And her forthcoming work is in the Journal of Documentation, the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies, and curator, the Museum Journal. Please welcome Dr. Kathy Carbone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and special thank you to Sasha and Allana for this opportunity. So my research broadly focuses on what artists do with archives, what archives inspire artists to do, and what is set in motion by artistic uses of the archive, and also what kind of relationships form and social relationships form and effects happen through artistic uses of the archive. And that's a broad paint, or a broad picture. But more narrowly, I focus on artists who have liberatory aspirations and who mobilize the archives as instruments towards some type of social justice or human rights endeavor. So I'd like to give one example of an ethnographic project that I conducted several years ago down in Portland, and I'll just dive right in. From 1965 to 1985, the Portland, Oregon Police Bureau, as part of its surveillance of over 576 activist groups, amassed thousands of photographs, notes, intelligence reports, news clippings, as well as materials generated by activists. Under surveillance were groups and organizations such as the Black Panthers, the United Farm Workers, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, to name just a few. In 1981, after Oregon law made it illegal to gather information on groups not tied to a criminal investigation, the records were slated for destruction. However, Winfield Falk, who was a lead detective in the surveillance program, instead removed the records from the police bureau and kept adding them, to them for years. So he kept surveilling on his own. Then, in 1989, he died from a heart attack, and the records ended up in a barn in eastern Washington. And so, in 2002, the Portland Tribune newspaper attained the files, and subsequently ran a series of articles about the program and about all of these records, right? And at that same time, Portland City Archivist Diana Banning, she saw the articles and thought, those should be in the city archives, right? That's history, that's important history to save. So she laid the legal groundwork to do so. And in 2004, the Portland Tribune transferred the records to PARC, City of Portland Archives and Records Center. And the archivists then processed the collection and named it the Police Historical Archival Investigative Files, henceforth files. And yes, okay, so now fast forward 8 years. And in 2012, PARC initiated a series of artist residencies, and from 2012 to 2015, investigative poet Kaya Sand and interdisciplinary artist Garrick Imatani were artists in residency at PARC. And during their residency, they exclusively engaged the files, transforming these records into photographic triptychs, spoken word performances, poetry objects, sculptures. And they did this in collaboration with activists whose lives that they encountered in the records. And they also worked with some artists from the Portland area and also beyond Portland, and one of the archivists at PARC. So Kaya, in particular, created several poems and poetry objects during the residency, including the multi-versioned poem entitled She Had Her Own Reason for Participating, which is my focus today. So at Park, while combing through the surveillance files, two things in particular struck Kaya. The considerable amount of police surveillance on movements regarding women, and two, the amount of fear she sensed in the files, stating, "There's clearly a lot of fear in the files, the thinking of the police that dissent needs to be suppressed." Kaya became interested in understanding this fear and changing it, what she calls flipping around the paranoia, through her work in the residency. So out of a desire to collage language, to coax lyricism out of the files, to see how meaning will accrete, Kaya gathered and collaged sentences she found in the files that began with the word she. And about this process with the poem, she writes, "She was always hunched over the machine. This was one of the first lines I read that prompted me to begin to collect sentences that began with she. So I sledgehammered these words into a copper card, hunched over on a patch of basement concrete. I added this line to hundreds of lines, beginning with the word she, a poem accreting into a crowd of women." Kaya imagines the poem as a kind of wire service report on conditions of women who were challenging the status quo from the 1960s through the 1980s, and a way for her, she states, to index the fear these police spies had about women, particularly women organizing for rights around domestic violence, labor, and peace issues. And as well, it was a way for her, she states, to commemorate women struggling for rights. So Kaya's poem exists as a poetry object consisting of nearly 30 copper plates, each of which is stamped with one line of the poem. The inspiration for the physical form of the poem came from boxes and boxes of index cards the police investigators meticulously kept. Cards and cards, just hundreds and hundreds of cards of people's names. And so here, this is how they looked when the archivists got them from the Tribune, but this is how the police kept them. And here they are with archival treatment. And then here is Kaya's poetry object, which is housed in a drawer in a plinth built by Garrick. When, as you can see, both the copper cards and the drawer mimic the police cards, and the card file. Kaya often recasts her poetry, and she had her own reason for participating for performance using a scroll. About her choice of form, she states, "There's a beautiful movement of a scroll. There's also a way in which it creates a kind of coherence. And that, I think, ultimately started to really make sense to me working with the police files. When everything's in pieces, there's a way in which the scroll gathers." So I'd like to play a little clip, Kaya speaking about working with the files, and she reads a bit of the poem.
There's hundreds of activist groups, surveyors, groups on domestic violence, there's coalition, against battered women. There's so many files that I glommed from American Indian Movement, Panther Party, Patriot Party. There's a lot of different groups, and I was really interested in just using the history of she. So gathering, in a sense, all these women of the 1960s and 70s and 80s through these unreliable narrators in some cases, through different points of view, because in the files are these surveillance documents that the police kept, and there's police reports, and there's newspaper articles, a lot of newspaper articles, and there's publicity materials from the activist groups. So you'll kind of see it swerving in a lot of different ways, but I was really interested in the fact that these are, in a sense, people who are positive as dangerous. She advised that the meeting began at 5 p.m. She also advised that, to the best of her knowledge, that she has no close friends or associates, which are either members of or sympathizers of any religious or political groups. She also went to night school. She always gets kidded about being a female mechanic at the auto parts shop. She attended Lindsay David. She began an hourly program in 1970 on the Portland radio station KBOO. She could be violent. She couldn't imagine sitting behind a desk all day.
Kaya also recast her poem into a spoken word performance for herself and park archivist Mary Hansen. And in a series of interviews that I conducted with both Kaya and Mary, each reflected upon their experiences transforming She into a collaborative spoken word performance. Kaya told me that, once the poem was on the cards, I realized it didn't have to be just my voice. The poem is intimately connected to Mary for me because I was always in the archives reading room, sitting at one of the tables, chit-chatting with her. I would be working on something with the files, or I might be reading, but I would always write down sentences if they began with she, and we would talk about this methodology. So I felt like it was a poem linked to Mary and her support of the poem. Mary and I talked so much about that work, and so it was entirely this kind of relational poem that came from documents, but also came from the relationship with Mary, and the fact that Mary has this interest in feminism and gender studies, and that her mother was involved in organizing a NOW conference in Houston in the 1970s, as well as started a cooperative daycare. So that poem for me, like she had her own reason for participating, feels deeply about Mary actually. So we decided that reading the poem together was a conversation because it has always been a conversation. Mary then described how Kaya introduced to her the idea of reading the poem together, stating that Kaya presented it to me that the work that we, the artists and the archivists, have done through this whole residency was collaborative, that we partnered in it. So it made sense to have this poem be partnered as well. It is a way to demonstrate how archives and archivists and artists can work together. They really do work together. And reading this poem together is a way to manifest that, to show that. One of the events where Kaya and Mary performed the poem was the art installation and performance, Art, Archives, and Activism that took place at Portland State University in February of 2015. Seated in front of the plinth that houses the copper plates, with a crowd of people standing around them and also peering down from a second floor balcony, Kaya and Mary took turns flipping through and reading each of the copper plates, at times changing the pacing between and repeating some of the lines, their voices and the clanging of the copper plates against one another vibrating and resounding through both bodies and space. Although Kaya and Mary conceptualized their performance of the poem as a response to and an enactment of a conversation with one another, their performance of She Had Her Own Reason for Participating did more than this. Not only did they respond to and enact a conversation with each other, they also responded to, enacted a conversation, and created relations between communities of women across temporalities and geographies, archival reference work, poetry making, and feminism. We can also consider their performance as a living archive itself, a repository and transmitter of Kaya and Mary's shared archival labors, histories and memories, sensations, ways of being together, and friendship. Moreover, Kaya's She poem is an archival intervention that challenges past and present meanings, values, and beliefs associated with the surveillance records. And this poetic intervention also challenges normative uses of and understandings of the archive, a place for research, not poetry making, and collaborative performance, a place of stasis, not transformation, especially of the embodied sort, and illustrates one of the ways in which bodies can perform, interpret, manifest, reinvent, transmit archives, as well as produce new relevancies with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, I'd like to introduce Danette Boucher, who was awarded her BFA in theater from the University of Victoria in 1989, and then returned to join us to do an MA in Applied Theater, Museum Theater, in 2011. Danette has enjoyed a 30-year career creating and implementing theater programs for museums and heritage sites. She is currently working on a book examining the role of museum theater in decolonization. Please welcome Danette Boucher.
So I often audition actors for different roles, and sometimes that has led people to ask for my advice. You know, if I'm going to audition for something, what should I or shouldn't do? And I would say, well, what you shouldn't do is go last. Because everyone is so tired and they're already thinking about dinner and drinks. So Here I am going last. What's that?
We're with you.
Thank you, Yuri. I mean, you kind of have to be. I don't get to go anywhere. I'm so inspired by the two women on the panel. Thank you so much. And your work is incredible. Allana got a hold of me probably last summer and sort of explained what this Gatherings project was about. And I talked to her at length and hung up the phone. And then my husband said, so what is the symposium about? And I said, I kind of don't understand because it's really complicated. So I was relieved when the question that I had to sort of answer was, how does your work intersect with archives? Because my work's pretty on the nose. I mean, I deal with the exact kind of archives that this museum deals with, people who collect history, but somewhere in my career as an actor, I stumbled into working in museums. And I've been doing it for 31 years, and it has changed significantly in 31 years. So when I started as a historical interpreter, a lot of the things that we're talking about today were not part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's something that I struggle with, and one of the reasons that I started I did my master's degree, which I started in 2006, and the conversation has changed drastically since then. So it's one of the things that I do really struggle with, like the site that I'm most closely associated with, although I'm not actually here representing them today, is Barkerville Historic Town and Site. So the way that British Columbia became a colony was because of a gold rush, two gold rushes, the Fraser River Gold Rush and the Caribou Gold Rush. One of the wooden boom towns that was part of this colonial invasion into the territory that I work on is the shared ancestral land of the Shuswap and Carrier Nations. So one of these towns somehow, against all odds, survived, Barkerville. And in 1958, Barkerville became a heritage site, and there was no break between when Barkerville was a gold rush town and Barkerville was a museum. It just went from one thing to another like in one day. So, the site that I sort of am most closely associated with is a monument to colonization. So that's where we are in Barkerville. That's where I am in my work, is struggling with this question of, do we need these stories anymore? Do we need to keep telling them? Do we need to keep archiving them? Is it time to kind of go, I don't know, maybe that's enough white settler history. Maybe we don't need any more. Having said that, that's kind of like saying, well, I'm going to throw out my life's work because it just doesn't fit anymore. But I actually think there is really a place for this, and especially in my case, because, and that's why I'm really happy you're hearing what you spoke about, is because I have such a strong responsibility to the women who came here. Their lives were not always easy, and they didn't always have voices. And so I get to give voice to some of these women. So I actually play a character in Barkerville. I played this character for over 30 years now. Her name was Florence Wilson, and she came to British Columbia aboard the first bride ship, which was a short-lived attempt to import British women to the colony of British Columbia. She came here because she had been quite a well-off woman, and she lost all her money because her father died, and she wasn't married. So she came to Victoria and worked for a while in government. She had a fancy goods and stationery shop on Government Street, and then she sold that to go up and to the excitement of the gold rush. So the story I decided to tell today, and I'm probably going to go over time, I'm sorry. I don't even know how long I'm going to be talking at this point, but I decided I would tell a story that I tell in a piece of interpretation in Barkerville called The Town Tour, where we go from one end of the town to the other and we tell stories about the site. And I'm very happy to say that we also in Barkerville have a Chinese history interpretation program and an Indigenous interpretation program. Our Chinese history interpretation program is 25 years old, and our Indigenous interpretation program is not even a year old. So I touch on those within the town tour, and it's funny because all day I had decided what I was going to tell this story, and then all day yesterday I thought, oh, it's the wrong story. I should talk about prostitution because I have a really good section in the tour about prostitution. But I realized I was just trying to show off. So look how socially responsible I am. So I'm going to tell a story of the Great Fire of 1868. In 1868, Barkerville burned down. And it fascinates me that this story survives because there is one newspaper article written about it, and because there was no gap between when Barkerville was a town and was a historic site. So this story has been passed from mouth to ear, from mouth to ear, from mouth to ear for years, for over 100 years. So it started to be passed from mouth to ear by people who lived in Barkerville, and then actors started to tell this story on the streets of Barkerville. And the way that we work at this particular site is we don't really write down and archive our scripts. We tell these stories. And the way another actor learns the story is they listen to the actor before them tell that story, and then they learn that story, and they tell that story. I also wanted to just say before I tell it that there's a couple of things I wanted you to, I'll just say this quickly. So I've been telling the story for many, many years, and then in the summer of 2017, the caribou burst into flames. And we were in a wildfire zone. And suddenly this story became so different and so much more significant. And I thought, as an actor and as an interpreter of history, I need to honor the people who are now coming to see this story, who have their homes burned all around them. So the thing that I did is so the archives that I have used here are oral histories that I inherited over the years. So when I got to Barkerville in 1993, I listened to another actor tell this story. So that's the first one. I have the newspaper article from the Caribou Sentinel. I have, I went to firefighters and I asked them what it feels like to be inside a fire. And I did that in 2017 because people were taking refuge in Barkerville who had been evacuated from their homes. And I thought, I can't talk about this the same way. I have to know what it feels like to be inside a fire. And my character, Florence Wilson, lost everything in the fire. I will be using a British accent because she's a British woman. So you kind of have to imagine I'm on a boardwalk in Barkerville. This signpost marks the exact spot where the Great Fire of 1868 started. The summer of 1868 was hot and dry, and drought conditions existed throughout British Columbia. Now, there's a description that's going to sound very familiar to many of you. The mining seasons of 2017 and 2018 will turn out to be two of the worst wildfire seasons in recorded history in British Columbia. 1868 was so similar. Now, I cannot tell you with exact authority how the Great Fire of 1868 starts. No one knows for sure. But I certainly can tell you the rumor of how the fire starts. It's printed in the Caribou Sentinel newspaper. We all believe it. And it has to do with where the fire starts. The fire starts right here. And right here, before the fire, stands a saloon. And that saloon is called Adler and Berry's New Fashion Saloon. And Adler and Berry's employs dancing girls. And the dancing girls in this gold rush are called hurdy-gurdy girls. Now, it said that on the afternoon of the 16th of September, 1868, one of these hurdy-gurdy girls is standing in the back room of Adler and Berry's saloon, and she's ironing her skirt in preparation for her evening of dancing. Well, if she's ironing her skirt, it does follow that she is standing in some manner of underclothes. Now, a miner's been sneaking around town this day. He's a bit of a scoundrel. He's been peeping in windows, trying to get up to no good. He peeps in the window of the back room of Adler and Berry's saloon, and he spies this young lady standing there indisposed, and he decides, as the Caribou Sentinel prints it, that he is going to sneak into the saloon and steal a kiss. What a pretty Victorian way of saying he's going to assault her. He sneaks into the saloon, he sneaks up behind the young lady, he grabs her, she's terrified, she tries to get away, they begin to struggle and they bump into the stove. Now the stove is lit. It's September, it's cold on Williams Creek, and she's ironing. She's keeping her flat iron warm. When they bump into the stove, they upset the stovepipe, and it falls off. Sparks shoot straight up towards the ceiling, and that ceiling is made of canvas. Starts on fire easily. And then that fire spreads right through to the tinder dry shake roof. Within minutes, Adler & Berry's is engulfed in flames. Worse luck. There is a wind this day, and the wind is blowing from east to west. The wind picks up sparks from the Adler & Berry fire, carries them over the road, and the first of those sparks alight on the rooftop of the Bank of British North America, roughly where the Barkerville post office stands upon your visit. So now we have a fire on either side of the street. The street is half as wide, and there are no spaces between the buildings. Within minutes, either side of the street is roaring in flames. Now we do have a small fire brigade in place, but they understand very quickly that they will not be able to stop this fire. This fire will burn itself out. My saloon is upstream. Now you might think the first thing to alert me that something is very wrong on this end of town is, say, the smell of the smoke. Barkerville always smells like smoke. You might think it's the roar of the flame. I can hardly hear it. What alerts me that something is very wrong is the sound of people's voices. There's always a lot of commotion, a lot of noise on the streets of Barkerville, but normally it's the sound of celebration. This is the sound of fear. I come out of my saloon, I look down the boardwalk this way, and I see a wall of flame coming right for me. The first thing I think of to do is the same thing that most of my neighbors are doing. I run right back into my establishment and I start grabbing whatever I can get my hands on. I make a little bag of my skirt, I put my things inside there, and I run over and I drop everything on the bank of Williams Creek. I look back, I think I can get that for a second load. I run back into my saloon, I grab a few more things, I drop them creekside, and this time when I turn round, my saloon has gone up. In 1 hour and 20 minutes, 116 buildings have burned to the ground. Evening settles in on Williams Creek and we're all just standing there. By the side of the creek are saved things all around us, gazing back at a smouldering pile of ashes that a few hours before had been our town. And we start making some very hard decisions. Some people leave that very night. More of us, we realize, we're not the sort to give up that easily. The very next day, we begin reconstruction of the town of Barkerville. In 1 week, we have 20 buildings back up. In a month, enough to get us through the winter. The only reason we stop is because we run out of supplies. The following spring of 1869, we complete the reconstruction of this town of Barkerville. So that's a little example of performances. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to all three of our speakers. I do have many questions, but I'm keeping my eye on the time, and I want to leave enough opportunity for you to engage with these fabulous artists here. So why don't we start with your questions? Does anyone have a question?
Can I ask a question of each of the presenters?
Sure.
Okay, she's looking very concerned. Why? Well, thank you very much to each of you for your amazing presentations. They were all very varied and yet I learned so much. Lindsay, my question to you is, you talked about the relational process of when you're working with your fellow artists on their relationship to the land and their process of working through decolonization. Do you think that archives have captured that relational process? And in what way, if they haven't, how can we capture the relationship building process? Because what I've seen in the panel before is a lot of records of programs, photographs, recordings, etc. But what about that relationship building process? I'm sorry, I forgot your name, Karen? Kathy. I guess my question for you is, what are the ethical implications of working with records that the police have gathered on people without their knowledge, possibly, and now they're sitting there, now free for strangers to sift through and take them and perform them, and possibly breaking all sorts of ethical considerations of the privacy of the lives of these people that have been documented through somebody's lens, with judgment, possibly. Danette, what can I say? I guess I'm blown away I've seen you perform, and I know the brilliance of what you bring to a performance. It's always floored me, and I think what you've done now is like 10% of your capacity. And so I guess my question is, how do we capture, through archive, the process of distilling the material that you work through, you and James, because you're also an author. So you look through all this material, and then you decide, and because of your brilliance of knowing theater so well, you've chosen what to say, when to pause for effect, so people can use their imagination. So how does that get captured when we're archiving the process of what you're doing? And I'm going to turn to Allana and say, I'm sorry for my questions.
Great questions. Who would like to answer first?
They probably heard enough of me, so.
Thank you for the question. Thank you. I don't really know if I have an answer. I think when I think about the deep connection and relationship that even within ceremony and some of the potlatching that I've been to, and there is that moment where people say, turn off your recording, don't film this. This is not filmable. This is not shareable. And so I think that has to be self-determined by the people that are doing the work. And so I think in my artistic practice, process is so important. The end product in terms of the final photograph or the final presentation is really a small part, I think, of what I'm really interested in. I mean, because I'm an artist and I engage, in the art world, and in some ways my practice is very conventional and being part of shows, and but I would say that fundamentally, and I think I've learned a lot of this in my counseling program, because I have a background in therapy, so confidentiality is really important in my practice, and honoring what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. So I'm not sure if archives has really engaged in documenting ceremony, or documenting that relationship to land. My work, I think, is an example that I've seen, and there's a lot of First Nations artists, I think, that are engaging with territory and land in different ways, and exhibitions that are happening to talk about land. Land is, a really big conversation in this country. I think what's really important is for Canadians to understand the legislation and the law in relation to dispossession of land and territory, and what has severed that deep connection and relationship. And I think it's a disconnect when Canadians don't know the truth.
Yes.
They don't know the truth, and so I think to engage with the work, there's always a dissonance there. And I think the reconciliation with settler identities within land is also complex too. And so we see these being teased out in the academy. We see these in conversation. We see them, coming to form. And that's, I think, the beautiful aspect of being able to experience that relationship is when people come together to give it form. Some of the theory and some of the practice around decolonization, it has a different lens depending on which position you take within it. And I think it is important to be able to document what that form looks like when it's happening. So that's the best I can say.
Great question. So there are a lot of ethical implications, right, of working with those records or of just those records being out there in the world. And so I do know, and I talked to park archivists about this, and about just making making the records public. And so they did do redactions as far as like if there was medical history, anyone's medical history, social security numbers, anything about children, anyone under 18, they redacted. So they spent years, going through everything and redacting. I know when the records were processed and ready and made available, the Tribune wrote, a big story about it, and I know the archives, promoted that they were there and that they were available for use. I don't know at that time, and I don't know if people came in and said, hey, wait, I'm in there, I don't want to be in there.
Yeah.
Actually, what I heard from the archivist is a lot of people came in wanting to be in there and were upset that they weren't in there. So now it's coming back to me. I didn't, and maybe I should ask them more, I go into more detail, but I don't remember them saying that someone was angry about being, in the records and being in the archives. However, I will say, and so in thinking about Kaya and Garrick's work, so they worked with any record that they engaged with and that mentioned someone, that they talked to that person. They didn't use someone's record, they didn't use someone's life in their art without engaging with that person and actually engaging that person. That person became a collaborator, right? So they worked with four activists. So they didn't just use someone's record without that person being involved in the art. And I followed suit, as far as what I wrote about. There was one activist I couldn't talk with. He lived somewhere else, and Kaya and Garrick talked to him and told him what I was doing and that I was engaging with their work and how I was writing about it, and he was fine with it, so I didn't talk to him, but all the other activists I did talk with and shared with them how I was interpreting Kaya and Garrick's work and also these records, right? And so it was important to me to get their approval, or that I don't want to represent them in a way that they don't want to be represented, or if there's something they don't want me to write about. There was one activist, she's like, you can't write, I'll talk with you, you cannot write anything down, and you cannot record me. And so it was very limited, so I had to rely on my memory, but then I was like, it really sounds like she doesn't want to, she wants to talk with me, and we had a really great conversation, and I feel like it informed what I was writing about, but I really didn't quote her, and I didn't use any of that conversation, in my work. So, yeah, thank you for the question.
Thanks, Anthony. So your question was, how do you distill all the massive amount of information down to a story? And it's funny, Allana, I don't know what it's called, but when you were like the boss of my defense.
The chair.
The chair. So I remember she said, one thing you called me on was I always talked a lot about how to tell the truth, and you said there's no truth in history, and now I always say that to people as if it's my own idea. Because we are interpreters, and that's why we're called historical interpreters. So really, you're so guided by what you are actually interested in, what your passion is. So that shapes the story, and also just telling it over and over again. And one thing I do, if I'm writing a play, I'm kind of locking those words down and deciding what I'm going to say. But when I'm working in a museum, I'm usually telling a story that's not locked down. And as I'm telling it, I'm kind of noticing the audience, and they're like, okay, so this part that I thought was really interesting, they clearly think is really boring. So I'm kind of going to gloss over. So really, theater and how theater works can actually affect the story, and whether, there are some parts of the story that you might say, nobody's ever interested in this, so I'm going to kind of clip that out. So in that way, I'm not a very good archivist because I'm a theater practitioner and I'm too worried about whether the audience is enjoying it. I forgot to say, before I'm probably good because I've probably been way too long, is that I had the great pleasure of working in this museum a few different times. I think I saw Janet in the back. And Janet hired me in 2007, I think, to work at an exhibit, the Titanic exhibit, and I got to play Molly Brown. And that was for 7 months. And so for the first 3 months, you're just kind of working out that story and getting up and telling it over. Like I was telling the survival, the night of the sinking, and and how it. So I got to, for like 3 months, just shape that story. And I, honest to God, like, we're actors, we love it when people love us. So if I told something and everyone went, oh, I'm keeping that. Like, everybody loves me when I do that part. So I mean, really, the way that I work is, I'm so interested in this story that I read, so I'm just going to assume that everyone else is. And the way that I'm going to find out whether or not they're really interested in it is by telling it. But also, of course, ethically, there are certain stories where there are things you can't leave out. There's something that's just so important to that story that I have the obligation to keep that in.
Great, thank you. Another question? Sika.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed your presentations tremendously. What I started thinking about listening to all of you is repetition in archives. We've talked a lot over the past couple of days about the singular things in archives. And I wondered about the role that repetition plays in thinking about land as archive and how the land repeats. And she repeating, oral history repeating. So just, do you think about it, or how would you reflect on repetition?
I guess the way that I'm interpreting repetition is, I would say, deepening relationship. So the more that I'm out on the territory, the more that I'm engaged in water, the more that I'm creating my vessel to be healthy and well, and the more that I engage, I always come away with a new understanding. So even though the behavior is repetitive, I think I always come away with a different perception, a different understanding. I see and hear, and picking up new information. And I think in terms of repeating, even the way that I work with other people, I get to see the mistakes. I get to see the gaps. I get to see the importance of the conflict. I get to see my blind spots. I get to see my ego. I get to see so many through repetition. And it's only in practice that all of the fragments become known. And that's also engaging with land in ways where you hear stories, the salmon didn't run this year. And so the way that people relate to this land and territory I think the more that we're engaging and trying to research our cultural knowledge and the ways that our relationship to land and territory, we're also seeing the devastation even more and more. And I think this is where the rise of activism is coming through. And we had our occupation with Indigenous youth for Wet'suwet'en here at the Parliament building. And what I was recognizing in that is the importance of education. Reconciliation education, and I was thinking about my generation, and I was having a conversation with an older man who's in his 50s, and I said, the youth that are here are not from our generation. They're the generation that hasn't been denied the knowledge and the truth, and they're the ones that are empowering with pride, and it's an amazing thing. And so when we look at changes of curriculum in BC, reconciliation education in this province, you can see the consequences of that. And so repeating over and over territorial acknowledgements, the history, the blanket exercises, all of this knowledge, it's about, we have to circle these conversations over and over and over and over to come to a shared memory, a shared vision moving forward. And so repetition is extremely important for all of those reasons.
Thank you.
I was thinking about repetition through performance and thinking about how repetition is a preservation strategy, right? And it's close to reenactment, right? And reinterpretation. And so also in those moments, in new contexts, whenever something's repeated, new relations are formed between that performance, between whatever the knowledge, whatever the memory, whatever it is that's being performed, right? So it's in a new context, maybe there are different people around, and so new relations are formed, new discourses come from that, new conversations come from, every time it's repeated. So, two things, it preserves the piece, but then it also opens up new possibilities, right? Because every moment's new, right? So it's going to always be different, open up new things, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think when we talk about repetition, we're kind of getting into this territory of oral history, which I think is really close in my work. And, I think that we all have the experience of having family stories. And the family stories are told again and again and again until they almost become a script. But we don't get bored. We say, Grandpa, tell us about that, or tell us this again, and then we tell the story, and we kind of smooth out all the edges. And so every year in my work, we have to respond to what's going on in the world. So I'm already thinking about how Wet'suwet'en is going to affect how I talk about things in Barkerville. And so when I go to work, there will be those new things, which is exciting. So how am I going to change the story so that I acknowledge what's happening in the world? And as a performer, that's exciting because it's like, okay, now I have to find a new way to do this. But I'm also aware that people, that there's those stories that I've told so many times that they're so smooth and they're so well rehearsed, and and I love telling them, and that's, I think, a part of oral history, is that our story becomes this kind of pearl that we've worked on forever and ever and ever, and then we tell a new story and we get that excitement of having this sort of really rough story, and it's like, well, and sometimes they're even better because they're a little bit rough, but we have to repeat them until they become really smooth. I think in the kind of museum work that I do, there's areas where I will not allow it to be written down. Like the town tour script, I won't allow anyone to write it down because I don't want someone who learns it from me to do it like I do it. I want them to find their own way of telling the story that gets them really excited. So I think maybe that kind of got in the neighborhood of addressing your question.
Thank you.
Good. I don't want to deny this side of the room your opportunity to ask a question. But there's a question on this side of the room.
I can go sit over there. So a question for Lindsay. So if the museums had the task force and archives have the protocols, what kind of strategies or models would you suggest within the realm of performance that might model or something the possibility of like ethical relationships and mutually respectful relationships in dance or in movement, in your opinion? Does that make sense? I can elaborate. So like, for example, I was recently, I'm a dancer, so, and like we grew up a few kilometers away from each other, but we've never danced together. Like, is that possible, or like, do you want that? I was recently at a fundraiser for the Downtown East Side Women's Association in Vancouver. So women are using that organization. It's a shelter amongst other services, and the fundraiser allows women, and it's directed by the women, to do a fashion show, and it's a performance. Each woman selects a song and performs that song anyway. So to me, the most ethical thing in that moment is to watch, I think, and to listen and to learn. Is that what we should be doing right now as performers, or is there any other actions that people might take?
I really don't have anything to that's in there that's coming up.
Yeah, I mean, these things have taken decades, right? So we can talk later.
If I might just sort of build on that question or take it in a slightly different direction, because one of the things that I think you've all noted and was certainly striking to me was the presence of women in all of this work. There has been a lack of women acknowledged in history and a lack of women's presence in the archives. And so, when you're doing this work, or when you're writing about the work that you were writing about, Kathy, do you see it as activist work from a gendered perspective, or is it something else for you?
In many ways, yes, and so when you go to northern BC, people have often a different outlook than they have when you're on Vancouver Island or on the coast. And one of the things that my dear friend Michelle Eferts, who works with me in Barkerville, and I got really sick of was the idea that every woman who came to a gold rush was a prostitute. So I started formulating a section of the town tour, which is what I did this fire story from, about prostitution, because I wanted to just be able to just make these guys stop saying the things that they were saying to us, which were really quite abusive, and they think it's hilarious. It's not everybody, but, so I spent a lot of time, and there's very scant information, trying to kind of find out what the lives of prostitutes were like or might have been like, and then just say that. So if there's a guy who's jeered at you earlier, it feels pretty good to have him in I have all the power when I'm the one telling that, and he's in the audience. And I like doing it. I like that section, especially if they've laughed earlier when I brought up hurdy-gurdy girls and didn't tell them the whole story of the hurdy-gurdy girls yet, which is quite tragic. So yeah, I mean, for me, that's a form of giving a voice. And one of the things that I say, and you probably notice that my style of interpretation, I'm not locked in just talking about the past. Like, I'm not stuck in the past and I don't know what's going on in the future. I say I can't, I don't feel that I can speak for these women, but I am the only person who is here to speak for them. And then I talk about the reality of the lives of prostitutes. And I say I won't be a party to turning their life into a punchline. And talk about that a lot. And often, I've had women in the audience, cry or just like a lot of vigorous nodding, that sort of, yeah, you go girl. And yeah, so for me that, the fact that there are whole sections of populations of women who have not left their stories for us to tell I feel really good about being able to be the one who's just not afraid to say it. And I will say that Barkerville is very good about leaving me alone and trusting that that I'll figure out how to do it, without getting a lot of complaints.
Just to kind of extend that, I would say, for example, we just created a piece, the latest piece that we just created is called Red on Red. And it is a direct response to the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women inquiry. And so this past summer, I was thinking a lot about this, and I thought to myself, this piece, we have to embody the spirits of the murdered and missing Indigenous women because we are here today. I'm alive today, I'm privileged to be alive today. And so really looking at the spirituality of my work and the privilege of life and being able to have a voice, exactly what you're touching on. And part of that, the accountability and responsibility to move those narratives in our culture. And so within the piece itself, a group of 3 other Indigenous women, Cheryl Henhock, Elowen Rose, and Nicole Mandarek, and myself, we had a huge struggle with that. How do we embody a spirit that's been murdered? How has this spirit been murdered? How did they go missing? And these conversations started some really intense inquiry through just story and narrative and talking. And then one of the, Cheryl, she said, before, and not always the case, but she said before a woman goes missing or murdered, she becomes invisible first.
Yeah.
And so we talked about the invisibility and how a woman becomes invisible in her life, the way that she sees herself, the way that people see herself. And so the whole front piece is coming to bring the inquiry forward, and then it switches into these very, very nasty slurs. Squaw, you dirty Indian, it just goes on, and the diminishing of the spirit is what you could see in the actual performance. And then right before there's a blackout, Elowen says, it's easy to become invisible, it's easy to go missing when you're already invisible. And then we scream and we're dying, and no, I got kids, no, please don't hurt me. Boom, blackout, and then when the lights come back up, we're dead. We have to embody this death. We have to, resurge those spirits and embody that and become dead. And that's a hard thing to do. Because of our own traumas, our own violence, our own bodies that we're becoming vessels for this life, this underworld, the underbelly. And then we said, you know what, the beautiful thing, the best gift that we could give to these women and to these spirits is resurrection. And sending them on a journey of peace and love and compassion and empathy, and to let them know that we see them. And then the director, the dramaturge, Jo Leslie, she said, well, who do you want to come to see this? Who do you care about seeing this work? And we were like, the spirits. That's who we care about. Maybe some women that are on the street, and struggling, that can see their story being embodied, and they could get some validation. And so I think the narrative of bringing woman identities and the strength and resilience and power and the importance of women in my work in particular is very important. And I have tried to work with Indigenous men specifically. I did my whole master's project on working with Indigenous men. And it's challenging. We've created and cultivated spaces and places for women to heal. We've created places and spaces for women to look, to analyze, to reflect, and we've abandoned our Indigenous men, our murdered and missing Indigenous men too, and so yeah, there's lots of work to be done for sure. And
Please answer, yes. Oh, okay. Well, just very quickly. To answer your question about like, do I feel like the work maybe I'm doing as activist or an activist archivist or activist scholar, and I would say yes, but actually it wasn't like a conscious thing. I was drawn to it, and I'm drawn to artists who are highlighting women's lives in the archives, right? And then, and it just wasn't conscious. But it has become conscious and something that I realized like, oh, this, I need to do this. And I need to also, it's not just the women, in the past, but it's also the women today that are using the archives and what are their stories, what are their lives like as artists, right? And so all of that, has become really, really integral and important to my work. So,
Good, well I think we're out of time, but I want to thank our three, Danette, Kathy, and Lindsay, for complicating that false dichotomy between creation and preservation. Before we all thank them, I just want to thank the Royal BC Museum for allowing us to be here today, and to acknowledge and thank Priyanka Chatterjee for her contributions throughout this whole process, and of course, a big, 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 big thanks to Sasha Kovacs, who is the Sasha, do you want to say some final words?
Sure.
Thanks to everyone today for taking the time to be here and to share your expertise and your experiences and your approaches to creation. I hope, and Allana joins me in hoping that this is actually the start of a project, a conversation, a partnership, more work to be done. I think what's become clear throughout all the conversation, and there's always more work to be done, right? But I think we really see it here at the site of this question about the preservation of performance. Whether that's the best word, whether it's another word, how to think about the function of the artist in animating the archive, the ethics of doing that work, the questions around that work. And so I'm really pleased to see such a kind of different group of voices come together in a room, and I think probably everyone at some point today has felt like, am I the best person to be talking about this? Is this really my field or not? And I really have liked that experience of, estrangement sometimes. So thanks for sitting in that, and I hope that, this conversation will continue. I do have your, if you've registered for this event, or if you've been invited to present, I have your email, your contact number, your name. We've obviously, documented some of these proceedings today, but if you've just kind of wandered in and you'd like to be part of this conversation, there is a sheet at the back table, so I'd ask you to, write down your name and contact, and I can also get in touch with you, and maybe we can start, moving this conversation forward. So thank you very much. Thanks again to Kim at the museum. I also want to say that one of my former students, Sarat, is the reason I was connected with Kim, and the reason that, this kind of collaboration and partnership has emerged. So thanks, and we'll continue. And our students, yes, who do so much. So Logan and Connor and Annie, speaking about archiving, they've been doing the work to actually record these events throughout the day. We've had so many volunteers here.
student volunteers to support this over the last 2 days, and I am ever grateful. So maybe we can end by thanking the people who have documented this event.